Okay, so, that's a little loud, but, okay, so I'm super excited about today. Last time I spoke, I realized I like doing this. I like speaking, but not really the speaking part. I like the preparation of it. Just because it forces me to really collect my thoughts and put them all together and make them into one cohesive message. And so, I just, I really like it just because it's I'm learning something completely new. And so everything that I'm going to say is something that I'm currently working on and that I'm currently learning and that God is teaching me. And so, lately, God's been putting in my head the past, what has happened to me, these past couple of years through mobile missions and Church Inside Out, and just thinking about all the things that God has done in my life and how I got to this point here. And so, I never really thought about it before. Before now, it was all just a big blur, and I couldn't understand any of it. And so, so I decided, what better to share than share what God has done in my life in Church Inside Out and mobile missions, and exactly, my perspective being, a pastor's kid and the son of a church planner, and how all that has drastically changed my life. And so, so this is not just going to be new for pretty much everyone here. It's going to be new for me because this is the first time I really gave it any thought. And so, I think the best place for me to start with that story is start with the most significant moment in my entire life. My entire life is built upon this moment. And so it was whenever I was about 6 or 7. It was me and my older sister, Grace. We were sitting in our living room. And, she had recently gone into leaders in training, which some of your kids are probably doing now. And so she began to learn how to share the gospel and the ABCs, admit that you are a sinner, believe that Jesus died, rose again, and then choose Jesus to be your Lord and Savior. And so she's been learning those things, and she decided to tell me about it. She led me through the ABCs, and I prayed a prayer. And the significance of this moment is not that I prayed the prayer. This was not the moment I was saved in my life. For years I said it was, but it was not. The reason for that is that I did not have the correct view of God. I knew that God was real all throughout my childhood, but I viewed him more as a chore than anything. I did not actually, believe the things he said. It's like what it says in James, even the demons believe in God. So to me, I was just serving God to have a good life. It was like God was a taskmaster who would give me commands and rules, and I would have to obey them. And so the importance of this moment is that it was my first time hearing the gospel. It was the moment I was introduced to missions. And so it was also something that I realized that, people care about me. My sister loved me enough to not just keep the gospel message to herself, but to share it with her little brother. And to me, that instilled in me a desire to do the same thing. And so it just so happened that a couple months later, my parents said to us, we're going to have another child. And so I was going to be a big brother. And so that was an incredible moment for me. And I remember praying to God that I would lead my little brother to Christ. And, if I could say, if I could summarize my life in one sentence, it would be, Elijah, you have no idea. And the reason for this is that my life has been defined by cluelessness and oblivious nature to the things around me. We even have a mobile missions pen that says "Wait, what?" with my face on it. And I also think that this was the very first moment that I ever thought that, I look back and I remember, whenever I prayed that, God was probably looking down in heaven you have no idea what's going to happen and how I'm going to complete that. And so, as I grew older, there became three things in my life that really, that were at the center of my life. The first was my friends. My friends, took center of my life. It was through Leaders in Training that I had tons of friends. And we had this great friend group growing up, and that was something I idolized. And then there also was missions. I grew up doing mission trips and eventually went internationally to a bunch of different countries. And those things, became something which I really liked, not because they were missions, but because I thought it was cool and I thought people would like me for it. And then the third thing was probably the most odd, but makes the most sense for me, which was church. Church was something that I loved because I was a homeschooler, and so church was the only time that I got socialized with people. And so, as I began to do Leaders in Training, I went on the mission trips, and it was on my first mission trip that I had the first experience of sharing the gospel with someone. Except it wasn't me sharing the gospel, it was one of my friends, and I got to sit there and watch, and I prayed at the end. And that same thing took place every single mission trip that I went on until I turned 13. Whenever I turned 13, it was like a rite of passage of me turning into an adult, of me no longer being a child, but being an adult like Jesus was whenever Mary and Joseph took him to the temple whenever he turned 12, signifying that, hey, you can do the things that we can do now. And so, in my family, whenever you turn 13, you go on an international mission trip. And so, all my older siblings did it, and it was finally my turn. And so I went to Panama in 2017. And it was there that I realized two things. The first is I began to question the effectiveness of everything I'd been told. It was like whenever we shared the gospel, we would give them a quick pitch and we'd say, make a decision. And then if they said yes, then we would say, repeat after me and pray the prayer. And then we would write down their name and their information to give to a church, and then we'd leave. And if they said no, we would just pray and leave. And then, it was towards the end of the trip, whenever we were writing down our testimonies, that I realized I don't have any testimonies. I don't have any stories to share from this trip because I wasn't sure if anyone I had shared the gospel with was actually saved. That was the question I faced, was I couldn't be sure if I'd ever led someone to Christ. And so, and then there was also the second realization, which was probably more heartbreaking to me at the time because I was very selfish. I realized that not everyone's gonna like me. I realized that, that people, there's people. Before I was living in my own little world and I was very selfish and I didn't give much thought to the people around me. But it was on this trip that I realized, there are other people and they have different opinions, different agendas, different things going on, and they're not always going to align with mine. And it was like the backdrop of my life had come crumbling down, and all that was left was a stage, and I was torn, I was broken. And and that was one thing that I held very close was missions, and it was on that trip that I was like, do I really love missions? Is this really what I want to do? And then, it was also around this time that I began to grow increasingly distant with my friends. There was a lot of things that happened, and I don't know, I feel like a lot of times I victimized my past, I made things out bigger than they were supposed to be. And I'm pretty sure a lot of children do that. And so, but to me that was terrifying. And so I kind of left those two things behind, missions and my friends, and I kind of set them aside. And I was like, okay, this is the one thing I have left is church. And I was like, oh no, I'm sorry. It was actually 2 weeks after we went to Panama that my parents announced that we were going to start a church plant. And so I was like, okay, this is great. Everything that I cared about is now gone. It was like everything around me was falling apart and I couldn't do anything to stop it. And I always imagined myself having a graduation party, eventually getting married and doing all these things, and it was all going to be centered around my church that I was at. And so, it was disappointing. I was very angry more towards my parents at the time. And then it was early the next year that I was still very resentful, but it was in that I found my love for nostalgia. I love the past. It's like, as I grew up, I became more childish than when I was a child. And so, like, for example, VeggieTales. As a kid, I hated VeggieTales. It was awful, but now I love it. And so, I began to watch VeggieTales, and I began to watch 3-2-1 Penguins and What's in the Bible, all of which were made by the same person, Phil Vischer. If you look on my graduation table, I have a book called Me, Myself, and Bob, and it's basically Phil Vischer's autobiography. And that's like one of my favorite books. And eventually I searched the name Phil Vischer on Right Now Media, and all that popped up was a conference video called What Do We Do When Our Dreams Die? And I was like, man, that's perfect. All my dreams have just died. Well, I need to know what to do next. And so, it was in that video that God would change my life forever. Phil Vischer said in the video, God doesn't want you to do big things, he wants you. He then proceeds to tell the story of Elisha and the Shunmi woman. If you don't know this story, it's basically Elisha, he's going through this town of Shunem, and this woman says, hey, come in, I eat with me. And Elisha did that, and every time he would pass through the town, the woman would invite him to eat with her. And so it got to the point where the woman said to her husband, I know this is a man of God, so let's build a room and furnish it with a lamp, a bed, a table, a chair. And Elisha was so pleased with this that he's like, okay, well, what can I give you? What can I do for you? And she didn't have anything that she wanted. But then Elisha asked the servant, and the servant said to him, she doesn't have any kids, and her husband is very old. And so Elisha called her back in and said, hey, by this time next year, you'll be holding a son in your arms. And so it just so happened at that time the next year, the woman was holding a baby in her arms. And so, so it got to the point where as the child grew up, he began to help his dad. And one day whenever he was helping his dad out in the field, he cried out, my head hurts. So one of the servants ran the boy back to his mother. The boy crawled in his mother's lap and died. And so Elisha, the woman went to Elisha and said, did I not tell you not to deceive me? Did I tell you not to get my hopes up? And Elisha said, take my staff and my servant, go back to the boy, lay the staff on the boy, and he'll come back. And the woman said, no, as long as you live and the Lord lives in you, I will not leave your side. So Elisha went back to Shunem, and the boy came back to life. And so it was through this story and this testimony of how Phil Vischer lost everything. It was this that I realized that I kept a lot of things in a higher place and I kept God. And it was like all these towers that had built up fell, and it was from that rubble that God began to build something far greater than what I previously had. And we see in the story that the Shunamite woman doesn't care as much about her son, but more about being as close to God as she possibly can. Although her son is good, although she wants a son, she cares about God so much more than anything else. And I think like that's whenever I realized that the best thing that I could possibly have is it's not my friends, it's not my church, it's not missions, it's God. There's nothing more to it. And that's I think why I began to love Church Inside Out and Mobile Mission so much is not because my dad sold me on the vision or because I really liked the idea of it, but because it was through mobile missions and the starting of Church Inside Out that I was saved. It was through the following weeks that I really began to see Jesus not as a taskmaster, not as someone to give me rules, but I really began to see him as my Savior. And so, if I could say anyone led me to Christ, it would probably be my dad, because it was through his actions and through everything he did, and it was through his obedience to Christ that I was led to Christ. It wasn't because he had a focus on trying to lead his family to Jesus and make sure we were all saved. It was because he was dedicated to God's vision that he had instilled in my dad. And so, I no longer began to see God as some deity I lived to please, to live a good life, but I saw him as a friend who makes my life good. And so, one of my favorite albums is called Mercury and Lightning. It's by John Mark. And so basically, this whole entire album is a story of his doubt and disbelief in God. And he starts with a song called Mercury and Lightning, in which he says, I've been chasing God, I've been chasing Mercury and Lightning, I've been pressing hard, but I've been coming up short. And so basically, what he's talking about is, I feel like I've been chasing this idea, this, Mercury is the Roman equivalent to the Greek god Hermes, the god of speed. And he's like looking at this picture with Mercury with his back turned. He's like, God, is this you? Because sometimes it feels that way. It feels like I'm trying to catch you, but I can never quite grasp you. And so he's pointing at this, and he's feeling like God has abandoned him. And then he goes throughout the album with all these other songs about how he's seeing God in his family, and seeing God in the unknown, seeing God in all these different things. And he eventually gets to the very last song, which is called Nothing Stands Between Us, which is his realization that the question is not, where are you, God? The question is, where am I? God's always been there. He's always been in these different aspects of my life. The question is, where am I? If there's really nothing that stands between us except for love, then what is my love focused towards? Is my love towards Christ, or is my love towards something else? And you can really put anything in that. Is my love towards fame? Is it my love towards money? Is my love towards that guy or that girl? What is my love actually focused on? And so this was kind of like what I was thinking at the time, is like, what is my focus on? Before it was on all those things, but now they're gone. And now all I have to focus on is God. And so, I began to focus on God, and everything began to change in my life. And in my testimony, there are kind of like three different stories that are all intertwined, which really drive the point I want to make. The first is about myself. If God had not taken away what was in my life and was taking up all this space and all my focus, then I would have never been saved. If none of that ever happened, if we had just stayed at our church, if I had never gone on an international mission trip, if my friends had all been good, then none of this would have happened. I would not be where I am. And, it's like I realize that God is the ultimate source of goodness and joy, and that all other good things that I view in this world are only reflections of that goodness. And it's like C.S. Lewis said, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing on this earth can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And so the second story in my testimony is that of my dad. Our family was talking one time, and my dad asked, I wonder what it would have been like if we just did mobile missions. At first, I thought that would have been great, but now that I look back on that, I realize that would have been awful. There would be no Church Inside Out. And nothing I ever, none of this, I would not be where I am. There would be so much emptiness in my life without it. And then the third story I haven't told yet, but it's that of my little brother. Like I mentioned before, my brother before he was born, I prayed that I would lead him to Christ. That was 10, almost 11 years ago. And, it was last summer. It was our first mission team that we were hosting, and I was sitting there, and I prayed to God, God, use me today. It was 15 minutes later that I was leading my little brother to Christ. I had no idea the things that God would do in my life. It was whenever I changed my focus, because there's been tons of moments I can remember where I was like, okay, I want to disciple my little brother. But nothing ever happened. I never really did anything because that was my focus. My focus was on leading my little brother, not on God. But it was whenever I changed my focus and put my focus that I want you to do whatever you will with me, God, that I was able to lead my little brother to Christ. And so, a friend once asked me, do you think it is our moral obligation to pursue what we find meaningful? I think yes. I think we should pursue what we find meaningful. But the only problem is that we don't know what is meaningful. We haven't explored all our options. If we had, then we would have realized that God is the ultimate source of meaning. If we had done and knew everything that this world has to offer, then we would realize that there's nothing on this world that really has any meaning. I lost it. I think that we should pursue what we find meaningful, but we have to explore other options. And the best way to figure those things out is to discard all other things. It's to hold this thing up to the light and be like, okay, is this worth to keep in my life at the cost of having a complete view of Christ? Is it worth it to have this friend in my life if it costs me my relationship with Christ? If it costs me from seeing a full picture of what Christ wants to do in my life? It's like Paul says in Philippians 3, indeed, I count it all as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ. Paul doesn't just count all these other things as bad. He counts them as loss. Like all these other things that I put my focus towards, they're not just bad, they're not just okay, they're loss. I lose whenever I pursue those things. Because the only way I can ever gain something is in Christ. We have such a limited amount of time and energy. And so we have to figure out what we want to put that towards very wisely. Are we going to put that time and energy towards something temporal, or are we going to put it towards something eternal? Sometimes these things are good things. They could be hobbies, or sometimes they can be little luxuries, or maybe they're your